Hello, it's 6 o'clock. I'm Nick Qureshi. This is the Early Rundown, making news today as the winter crisis grips the NHS. Sky News takes to the road to see the pressures faced by healthcare workers firsthand. German media reports that Berlin will send Leopard tanks to Kiev and allow partner countries to do the same. Sky News hears the US will follow suit with its own Abrams tanks, with a deal from both countries expected as soon as today. Also, a report lays bare the severe economic disparity between the North and South as political leaders gather in Manchester to discuss the levelling up agenda. The boss of Royal Mail faces another round of questioning by MPs after hundreds of complaints about evidence he gave last week. And we'll have a full run-through of this morning's front and back pages. Hi, morning. Good to see you on the Early Rundown. So, leading the news this Wednesday with the NHS facing crisis, Sky News has seen firsthand the reality of working on the front line of emergency care. Ambulance response times are currently the worst on record, and the NHS is struggling to cope with a surge in demand this winter. We heard about the daily pressures for patients and paramedics who often face queues outside A&E of up to 15 ambulances. Our Midlands correspondent, Becky Johnson, joined a crew for their 12-hour shift. And here's her report.
It's the first call of the day for ambulance technician Dan and paramedic Danny.
It's on the way to an elderly man at the minute who's got swelling and pain to one of his arms following some falls. Hello, Edward. Morning.
Edward's arm injury looks serious.
You've done a number on that, haven't you?
He's got advanced Parkinson's.
Bless him.
He fell 2 days ago, but his wife delayed calling an ambulance.
That's all right.
The intense pressure on the NHS and advice on recent strike days put her off.
I did say on the television, only call if it's a matter of life and death.
No, don't worry. If someone falls over, give us a call.
However full the hospitals are, patients like Edward need to be seen. They persuade him to go to A&E.
People are a bit scared, to call ambulances because they think they're going to be stuck in the corridor for a long time or in the back of the ambulance. Straight into that.
Straight in.
Straight in. How unusual is that?
Very unusual.
It's often a very different story this winter.
There's some days where we're sat outside and there may be 10, 15 ambulances sat outside hospital and we've all got patients on the back.
And the next call, a Category 1, a reminder of the need for ambulances to be able to respond immediately.
Yeah, so we've got an elderly lady who's coming through that she's having or has had a seizure of some description.
They quickly establish there's a problem with the patient's heart.
ECGs are all over the place, to be honest with you. You're going to need some kind of pacing going on, mate.
Her heart rate is so low, there's a danger it could stop.
Heart rate at the minute is 29.29, symptomatic.
They start treatment and are calling ahead to the hospital in Coventry.
But yeah, he's gave 5 minutes to you, mate. You're definitely going to want to release us.
She goes straight in for emergency surgery to fit a pacemaker. When you see how quickly they have to move on a serious call like that, you can understand the frustration and concern on the days when they can't get to those Category 1 calls because they're queuing outside hospitals. This time they were able to save the patient, but at the moment there are no guarantees. Can things go on as they have been for the last few weeks?
No, things can't go on as they are, really. Early the cardiac lady, on a normal kind of busy day we would normally see, that would be a massive delay and potentially resulted in somebody's life.
Have you ever known it to be like this?
No, never. Something has got to give.
The question is what? With long delays, strikes and thousands of excess deaths, the pressure on the NHS is unprecedented and the route to recovery far from clear. Becky Johnson, Sky News, Coventry.
Now, let me just tell you that at 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, Sky News will be hosting a live phone-in show called NHS Your Say. We want to hear your experiences, of course, good or bad. Call on 020 8167 2200. Leave us a message for your chance to speak on the programme. Later on Thursday, tomorrow, we'll be hosting a special debate on the issues facing the NHS. Simply scan this QR code. That will bring up an email form for you to apply to be part of the audience at University Hospital Coventry. We'll be asking simply, can the NHS survive? You can also apply, in fact, by emailing NHS nhscrisis@sky.uk. The debate broadcast at 7 o'clock here on Sky News tomorrow evening. There are multiple reports in German media that Berlin has decided it will send tanks to Ukraine. It's understood Chancellor Scholz will allow other nations operating the German-made Leopard tank to send their own consignments of the vehicle. He faced weeks of pressure to allow shipment of the tanks, seen as crucial to Ukraine's defence against the Russian invasion, but was likely waiting on the US to send its own Abrams tanks, which now also look imminent. We'll have more on that in a moment. First, though, Siobhan Robbins on the anticipated announcements from Germany.
It's a question which has been dividing allies for weeks. Will Germany release the Leopard 2 battle tanks to fight in Ukraine? Now, finally, an answer seems imminent. A diplomatic source told me German approval for Poland to send its Leopard 2 tanks is expected this week. With German media reporting, the Chancellor is also likely to send some of their own stock. Nothing is official until Olaf Scholz makes an announcement. And one of the questions which has been delaying this decision is whether by sending battle tanks they could escalate the war in Ukraine. By acting alone, Berlin could be a target. So I'm told that Germany has been looking for a similar commitment from allies, particularly the US. This is what America has on the table, its much prized Abrams. As speculation swirled it was poised to send them as part of a joint package of heavy weapons, the Pentagon refused to be drawn.
I have no announcements to make at this time, and when and if we do, we'll be sure to let you know.
Britain has already confirmed it's sending 14 Challenger 2s. Vital weapons in a conflict President Putin is showing no desire to end soon.
The only way to lasting peace is to make it clear to Putin that he will not win on the battlefield. Therefore, we must provide heavier and more advanced systems.
On the battlefields of Ukraine, troops in Soviet-era equipment are desperate for modern machines. Experts say a delivery of battle tanks could be crucial.
It does give them a punch. It certainly evens out the odds on the battlefield, and it gives Ukraine the option of an attack that at the moment is a little bit less likely for them to be able to do and succeed.
The German government says a decision will come soon, but refused to comment further. While the wait continues, in Ukraine, there are fresh hopes that the tanks they've been pleading for could soon be on their way. Siobhan Robbins, Sky News, Berlin.
So any announcement from Germany will likely coincide with one out of the US, and Sky News understands that could come as soon as today. Russia has responded to that news, saying that any tanks sent by the United States would be destroyed. Mark Stone has more now from Washington.
Well, it was only a few days ago that the Americans were giving a firm no to Ukrainian requests for their battle tank to be deployed to the front line in Ukraine. But at the same time, almost in the same breath, the Americans were saying, stay tuned. And I think there has certainly, you could generously call it, an evolution of thought that has taken place by the Americans and by the rest of the Western allies. Ungenerously, I think you could call it a bit of a debacle. Certainly it has presented a split in opinion by Western allies who have tried as much as they can to be united over the war in Ukraine and how to counter the Russian offensive. It is clear, though, that over the course of the past few days, something's changed and we can now expect an announcement from the White House to come any time now. Today is very, very likely, I think, an announcement that will see in one form or another, American battle tanks being prepared to be sent to Ukraine. The details, though, well, we will await those. I think what this will do is unlock the German reluctance. Remember, the Germans had always said they didn't want to send their own battle tanks to Ukraine unless the Americans and others did the same. The Americans have got existing concerns over the supply chain. Their M1 Abrams is a very complex bit of equipment. They were worried that the jet fuel, for example, that it needs to get it moving is not readily available on the front lines in eastern Ukraine. There are supply issues. There are maintenance issues. And so over time, I think they will work out how they can resolve these so that they can get their own tank to the front line. But yes, this opens up what was a difficult moment for the alliance as they tried to find some unity over this issue with battle tanks that the Ukrainians say they need. But the Americans said stay tuned. I think all eyes on the White House today.
Meanwhile, the families of 2 British men killed in Ukraine say they sacrificed their lives trying to help others. 28-year-old Chris Parry and 48-year-old Andrew Bagshaw were volunteering in eastern Ukraine. They were evacuating civilians from the town of Solidar when it came under attack from Russian forces. The family of Mr. Bagshaw spoke earlier from their home in New Zealand.
It has been confirmed that our son, Dr. Andrew Bagshaw, has died. He and a colleague, Chris Parry, were attempting to rescue an elderly woman from Solidar. He took many personal risks and saved many lives. We loved him. We are very proud of everything that he did there.
In a statement, Chris Parry's family said his selfless determination in helping the old, young and disadvantaged there has made us and his larger family extremely proud. We never imagined we would be saying goodbye to Chris when he had such a full life ahead of him. He was a caring son, fantastic brother and best friend to so many, and a loving partner to Olga. I'm going to bring you some breaking news on Sky News this morning. A Metropolitan Police officer has pleaded guilty to several counts of child sexual offences. Yesterday, PC Hussein Shahab pleaded guilty to 4 counts of sexual activity with a girl aged 13 to 15 between March and September 2019. That was before his service in the Met. Also, 3 counts of making indecent photographs of a child and 1 count of engaging in sexual communication with a child. No verdict was recorded in a further 4 counts. And in fact, we're told by the Met that 22-year-old will now face an accelerated misconduct process. Now, it's one of the government's landmark programmes, Levelling Up, a commitment to spread opportunity and investment more equally across the United Kingdom. New figures today, though, pour some rather cold water on that idea. The IPPR's State of the North report highlights a severe regional disparity between the North and South. It also points out that nationwide, the UK receives one of the lowest levels of investment of any rich nation. Well, Mari Aurora is with us now, talking about pouring cold water. That's very good, isn't it? I can have a little sip. Tell us about this report. Perhaps not surprising that this organisation based in the North said they're hard done by, but some of the figures are quite staggering here.
They really are, and I think you're right. I think a lot of people in the North will not be shocked or surprised at all by these findings. I think it's a reality that they're living every day, and therefore this is really just confirmation of their lived experience. So this IPPR report, they're a left-leaning think tank, and essentially they're looking into the lack of investment in the North. And their findings suggest that there's vast inequalities and systematic underinvestment when it comes to research and development, when it comes to social infrastructure and transport. And they're basically trying to say that productivity and hourly pay, those are the kind of 2 major things that are massively lower in the North than they are in the South, and therefore that's underpinning some of those regional inequalities. Now, this is coming all at the same time where we've got that Convention of the North happening today. It's going to be attended by, big kind of political heavyweights like Michael Gove, his shadow Lisa Nandy, and also Andy Burnham, the Greater Manchester Mayor. they're going to be speaking at that event. And the convention is essentially a kind of annual event for businesses and political civic leaders to kind of get together and essentially try and find ways and discuss ways of improving the kind of financial outlook of the North. Now, the issue here is we had the Levelling Up Fund last week that was announced, quite heavily criticised. I think a lot of people felt that it was not necessarily evenly distributed between the South and the North. But also we had Andy Street, the West Midlands, Metro Mayor, basically kind of criticising the government for a begging bowl culture when it comes to devolved powers, regional devolved powers. So now we have a situation where essentially will, especially Northern voters, but perhaps voters in general, get quite sceptical about promises around levelling up and, getting rid of regional disparities, when so far it doesn't necessarily look, especially if you look at this report, like the government has really made good on some of those levelling up promises. And could that potentially, down the line, before the next election, lead to the collapse of the Red Wall? Big questions for Rishi Sunak
Yeah,
today.
forefront of their agenda. It has been for a long time, hasn't it? Well, that's a big meeting today in Manchester. While that happens, it's Wednesday. It's going to be a big meeting in the House of Commons, the weekly Prime Minister's questions. I'm sure Rishi Sunak's going to get a rough ride, isn't he?
He definitely is. I think it's a very tricky day for him on so many different levels. I think at the moment the opposition have so much ammunition. They have the Nadhim Zahawi ongoing controversy. We have the BBC chairman Boris Johnson £800,000 loan controversy, and then we also have this new report about the lack of investment in the North. So take your pick in terms of choose your weapon, as it were. I think. At the moment, we have Nadhim Zahawi still in post, despite the fact that MPs like Caroline Noakes have essentially said he should step aside until the investigation is over, just to kind of clear the air and create a real kind of a sense of transparency and honesty, which is obviously supposedly Rishi Sunak's priority. And I've been speaking to a former minister to try and gauge the kind of temperature in the Tory party. And this former minister was telling me they think that Rishi Sunak should have sacked Nadhim Zahawi long ago. They're shocked that he hasn't sacked him. And actually, they want him to be sacked before Prime Minister's questions to almost pull the rug from underneath Keir Starmer's feet and essentially kind of nullify some of his political attacks. Never mind, obviously, the Boris Johnson controversy going on. So key date for the diary is the 7th of February, which is the date for the Partygate evidence, but also when Richard Sharp will be speaking to the DCMS committee.
And of course, before that key date today, 12 o'clock, a few hours to go, we will see if there's any movement with Mr. Zahawi, won't we, before that? Thank you, Mari. And don't forget, of course, you can watch Prime Minister's Questions live in its entirety. Here on Sky News, it all starts at midday. Right, it's Wednesday morning. Here are our top stories on the early rundown. With ambulance response times currently the worst on record, Sky News has seen firsthand the reality of working on the front line of emergency care. There are multiple reports in German media that Berlin has decided it will send tanks to Ukraine to boost its firepower in the war against Russia. And a report, as we've been talking about, has found a severe disparity between the North and South as political leaders prepare to gather in Manchester today to discuss the levelling up agenda. And plenty of those stories make today's front pages. Let's look at the FT reporting on Germany's anticipated announcement that it will send tanks to Ukraine. The Guardian leads with that story, calling it a historic move. The Telegraph says it's a hammer blow for Russia. The Metro focuses on that IPPR report with the headline, "It's grim up north." The Times looks at a warning that the UK's economic prospects have declined, leaving a multi-billion-pound hole ahead of the spring budget in March. The Eye says the Treasury is ruling out any tax cuts after being surprised by recent government borrowing levels. And the Mail points to those borrowing figures, saying it shows the need for growth. The Express, meanwhile, warns the Chancellor against any move to increase the pension age. The Mirror leads with mistakes made by the probation service after a review into the murder of Zara Alina, calling them deadly failings. Today's Star reports on an alert about Chinese spies supposedly using everyday gadgets against us. And The Sun says a UK-filmed game show based on the Netflix hit Squid Game turned to some real-life horror for contestants. Now, if you want to see any of those front pages again, or indeed read the stories, then do scan the QR code on your screen. That will take you to the press review on the Sky News website. Let's have a look at some other stories this Wednesday. And Mike Pence has become the latest high-profile US political figure to have classified documents found in his private home. The former vice president's lawyer says the materials have been handed over to the FBI. The discovery puts him in the company of his old boss, Donald Trump, and President Joe Biden. Chris Hipkins has been sworn in as New Zealand's Prime Minister, replacing Jacinda Ardern, who resigned unexpectedly last week. With his Labour Party trailing their Conservative rivals, Mr Hipkins may be in for a tough general election later this year.
This is the biggest privilege and responsibility of my life. I'm energised and excited by the challenges that lie ahead. The Deputy Prime Minister and I both take today's appointments very seriously. As Prime Minister, I acknowledge the important nature of my role in advising the Sovereign and the Governor-General.
Meanwhile, there were emotional scenes as Jacinda Ardern left Parliament, joined by dozens of her former staff members and admirers. The former Prime Minister will stay on as a backbencher until April.
Thank you.
Also, let's tell you about more street battles between protesters and police in Peru's capital, Lima. Violence there has killed more than 50 people since last month, when Pedro Castillo was ousted as president and detained after trying to dissolve Congress. His supporters are demanding he be freed and returned to office. OK, let's see what's coming up a little later today, shall we? Just after 8 this morning, Kamali will be speaking to the Shadow Levelling Up Secretary Lisa Nandy about the State of the North report. At 8:20, we'll hear from Ukraine's former Deputy Minister of Defence, Alina Frolova, and discuss the prospect of tanks being sent to Ukraine. Then at 9:30, the filmmaker and activist Richard Curtis will talk about his star-studded campaign against banks financing fossil fuel expansion. Now, don't go away. The business news is next, including why the boss of Royal Mail will once again face questions by MPs, plus the defence companies seeing a boost in value. Hello, welcome back. Let's have a look at the business news now. And the boss of Royal Mail is facing another round of questioning by MPs. The Business Select Committee says it received hundreds of complaints about Simon Thompson's evidence last week, including his denials that the company tracks employees' productivity through their handheld computers. The aerospace and defence company Raytheon has reported strong fourth-quarter profits, beating analysts' estimates. Increased travel demand boosted the need for its jet engines, parts and services. Defence contractor Lockheed Martin also beat Wall Street expectations, with increased sales of a range of products, including of weapons being sent to help Ukraine. Rupert Murdoch has scrapped his proposal to merge News Corp and Fox a decade after splitting them up. The billionaire media mogul sent a letter to both media companies indicating that he and his son, Fox chief executive Lachlan Murdoch, had determined that it wouldn't be optimal for shareholders. Amazon's UK operations are being hit by strike action for the first time today after workers at a warehouse in Coventry walked out at midnight. The GMB union says it expects around 300 Amazon employees to take part. They've been in a months-long negotiation over pay, marred by Amazon increasing starting wages by 50 pence an hour last year. Amazon insists its pay is competitive, but workers on strike say it's far from enough to live on.
You know, it's not an easy decision because we're losing money from here as well. Yeah, as we walked out, we're not going to get paid. We are going to get paid something, but it's compared to what we're going to... Obviously, it's nothing. But, you know, for the future, obviously, we need it as everything has gone up. Everything has doubled up. Fuel, gas, electric, grocery. And what pay rise we've got, unfortunately, it's not enough.
OK, we can have a look at the markets. What's happening in Asia? Huge gain right now on the Hang Seng in Hong Kong. The Nikkei still up, dropped a bit since last hour, but there you go. As for the currency markets, the pound, let's have a look, trading against the dollar. What is it? 123, up very marginally there. Against the euro, it is at 113. And Brent crude, pretty flat at the moment, $86 per barrel. Let's take a check on the business pages. The FT reports that activist fund Elliott Management has become one of the largest shareholders in Japanese conglomerate Dai Nippon Printing, building a $300 million stake. The Guardian crunches the numbers of the UK's record borrowing last month. That came out yesterday, reporting that it was pushed up by energy bill support. And the Eye says there's a jump in firms facing critical financial distress, and the UK may have a wave of companies and businesses going bust this year. Now, Ian King will be here at 10 o'clock this morning, rounding up all the city news and plenty of interviews, much more. Join Ian King live on Sky News, 10 o'clock this morning. Right now, though, weather time.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
This week looks mainly dry and mild, but the southeast will take time to warm up. It will be mostly mild but fairly cloudy through the rush hour, with hill fog and outbreaks of rain in the north, but southern Britain will be cold. There'll be a patchy frost there and dense fog in places. Hello, welcome back. This is the Early Rundown. These are our top stories this Wednesday. As the winter crisis grips the NHS, Sky News has taken to the road to see the pressures faced by healthcare workers firsthand. German media is reporting that Berlin will send Leopard tanks to Kiev and will be joined by the US, which will send its own Abrams tanks. And a report has laid bare the severe economic disparity between the north and south as political leaders gather in Manchester to discuss the levelling up agenda. Now, nearly 2 years after they seized power in a military coup, Myanmar's ruling junta is promising free and fair elections. But with civil war continuing, the military is accused of a violent crackdown to crush dissent in the face of a growing armed resistance. The country has been largely cut off to Western journalists since the coup, but our Asia correspondent Cordelia Lynch has gained rare access. Since the coup, more than 2,700 pro-democracy activists and other civilians have been killed and more than 13,600 detained. The UN has accused the regime of a flagrant disregard for human life, bombarding areas with airstrikes in what could amount to war crimes. The country's ousted leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, is serving a 33-year prison sentence. Well, Cordelia visited Naypyidaw, Bagan and Yangon, all in junta-controlled Myanmar. And this is her special report.
Driving through the darkness in Myanmar, we're on a packed bus in a place some call the land of shadows.
We're up very early in the morning, and that's because this is the time when the nation became independent, and that, of course, is what today is all about.
As our convoy comes to a stop, a glimpse of the theatrics to come. They've been preparing for this moment for weeks. Performers shipped in to show their loyalty, all for a parade celebrating bucking British rule 75 years ago. A chance to try and prove to the world and its own people it's thriving. This regime seized power in a coup. Nearly 2 years later, the tanks are rolling back in. Perhaps an obvious bookend for the city of Naypyidaw, a military utopia built on hubris.
Very little has been seen of life inside Myanmar since the coup. Western journalists rarely given any access, but this is a moment the military want to share, and perhaps feels it needs to.
For it's been accused of torture and mass killings. condemned by the UN and sanctioned. Not that money looks like any issue here. The military overthrew a democratically elected government. It claimed the landslide victory was electoral fraud. Since taking over, the junta has locked up and killed opponents. This is the man at the helm, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing. The situation, he says, is now under control, and he's promising the people a vote. But this is a piece of performance art from the cradle of the coup. Outside this theatre, there is real and intense fighting. Peace, currently as elusive as democracy. We wait 6 days to get clearance to leave the capital. This is a country well known for jailing journalists. It is largely because of brave local ones and those willing to risk it all to film that we've heard anything about life here beyond the junta's claims.
Well, after lengthy discussions with the military government, we've been given permission to film elsewhere in Myanmar. It is a chance to see and hear from people beyond the seat of power.
We're on our way to Bagan, a tourist destination they presumably hoped would showcase how secure and stable the country is. The mass protests are long gone. Now mass surveillance is the talking point. It's majestic here. But within minutes, we see a hint of the conflict beyond. Soldiers carrying supplies, crossing the famous Irrawaddy River, where rebellion still rages, an area we were told not to go to. Locals tell us it's nothing new to these waters, and some are deeply anxious. We've decided to protect the identities of everyone we've spoken to. Those who do talk risk being detained and interrogated.
When there is intense fighting over there, they cross the river.
Do you feel unsafe?
Yes, we don't have any safety. We could die at any moment.
How close are we to some of the fighting?
It's not that far. It's about 3 miles away from here.
We'll burn down the whole village, the man shouts. That's allegedly the voice of a soldier about 20 miles away. The military is accused of torching communities. Targeting civilians in airstrikes. And labelling opponents as terrorists. The Tatmadaw is facing a growing armed resistance from the People's Defence Force and ethnic armed groups. The currents of a civil war shifting, and the military doesn't control vast swathes of the country.
Over there is the Pakoku Bridge, and it leads to the Magway region, and we know that fighting is taking place there, but we can't cross because we've been told by the government we're not allowed to, and there are checkpoints on either side. You don't feel far from the trouble here, though, and local people have told us they can hear the clashes across the river. However you frame the balance of power, the economy is fragile here. Many desperately waiting for the arrival of more tourists.
My life has got worse since the coup. I almost lost my job. My savings are gone. We all depend on the visitors for our livelihoods.
What has life been like since the coup?
I hear the sound of fighting from the other side of the river at night.
Do you think there can be free and fair elections here?
I don't think so. They are using their weapons and their power to threaten the people. I don't agree with them.
Most soaking up this sacred sunset are Burmese. It may be safe inside the city, but with conflict around the country, outsiders wanting a pilgrimage to these pagodas may need to take a leap of faith. We're on our way to Yangon when we suddenly get a call from the military spokesperson. He's been hard to reach and has done very few international interviews. The military is accused of burning villages, running indiscriminate airstrikes, torture, mass killings. Do you have any intention of ending the bloodshed? But the UN says the regime has deliberately targeted civilians and committed war crimes. Around the mist-shrouded lakes of Yangon, life looks normal. But when you look back to where those birds fly, you see where thousands once marched. A revolution has fallen silent. Many protesters fled, many are in prison. The days of anti-coup tattoos are all but erased. Why do you think people wanted those tattoos?
Everybody was hyped up. That's why they did it. And at the time, it was like they were showing their strength.
What about now? Do you think people would feel comfortable having those tattoos?
No. When people travel overseas or domestically, they were inspected. Those who travel regularly had to cover them with additional ink. Some people chose not to travel at all.
Does it feel like the military is watching everyone?
They spread the information around and remind others that if they do the same, they will be in the same trouble. As a result, people are terrified.
There's a pervasive sense of fear. The feeling that your every move is being watched. That can be a potent propaganda tool. The stakes too high to share your frustration. What does life feel like in Myanmar right now?
We live in fear and insecurity. It is impossible to protest because young people are being controlled and arrested. That's why the youth are going toward the armed resistance.
Do you feel like the junta, the security forces, are monitoring people in the resistance?
The junta could simply monitor what young people are doing online. The internet is how they control the youth.
You can force a city to play ball publicly, but you can't crush sentiment. This is a fractured country, and in places now very violent. With that jeopardy, it's very hard to see the military rushing to let go.
Cordelia Lynch with that special report. You're watching the Early Rundown. Here are our top stories this Wednesday, with ambulance response times currently the worst on record. Sky News has seen firsthand the reality of working on the front line of emergency care. There are multiple reports in German media that Berlin has decided it will send tanks to Ukraine to boost its firepower in the war against Russia. And a report has found a severe disparity between the north and south as political leaders prepare to gather in Manchester today to discuss the levelling up agenda. Right, let's run you through the front pages then. The FT reports on Germany's anticipated announcement that it will send tanks to Ukraine. The Guardian leads with that story, calling it a historic move. The Telegraph says it would represent a hammer blow for Russia. The Metro focuses on that IPPR report. Its headline simply, it's grim up north. The Times looks at a warning that the UK's economic prospects have declined, leaving a multi-billion-pound hole ahead of the spring budget in March. The Eye says the Treasury is ruling out any tax cuts after being surprised by recent government borrowing. The Mail points to those record borrowing levels, saying it shows the need for growth. The Express, meanwhile, warns the Chancellor against any move to increase the pension age. The Mirror leads with mistakes made by the probation service after a review into the murder of Zara Alina, calling them deadly failings. The Star reports on an alert about Chinese spies supposedly using everyday gadgets against us. And The Sun says a UK-filmed game show based on the Netflix hit Squid Game turned to real-life horror for contestants. To go a flavour of what's on the front pages, Mari is back with us now, delving further inside, and a lot to do with the economy. Many of these headlines are seen on the front pages following the borrowing figures out yesterday. What have you found?
Yeah, so not good news, unfortunately. I have to warn you, Nick. But I wanted to start with this story.
It seems to be good news when we sit together, doesn't it?
I know, I'm so sorry. I promise it's not me. But there's a story in the Eye, and this is all about how we've had that, like you said, that data about public sector debt. And this is all about how, essentially, those new figures that we're not expecting to that extent mean that tax cuts are completely off the table for Jeremy Hunt in the spring statement in March. So obviously we know there are still lots of Tory MPs who are really hoping to have more of a kind of pro-growth agenda. And this is obviously going to come as a big disappointment to them, especially on the kind of Liz Truss backer side. So there's some detail here about how the Conservative Growth Group, which is made up of kind of Liz Truss backers, a bunch of Tory MPs who essentially want to see growth pushed and tax cuts as soon as possible. The real question is, are they going to potentially cause problems, cause difficulties for the Prime Minister and the Chancellor if they don't get what they want in the spring statement? It really depends on kind of how powerful they end up actually being. We don't know yet. It was only formed last week, but it talks about how we know in December the government borrowed £27.4 billion, which was more than twice as much as a year earlier and £10 billion more than the forecast. And basically that was due to the big energy package to try and help people with their energy bills, and then also combine that with rising interest rates, and therefore it's just more expensive to service the debt in the first place. So, sorry, not the best news.
Any glimmer of hope anywhere?
More bad news in the Times, unfortunately, Nick. So on the front page of the Times, similar story, but they've got some interesting detail from the OBR. So this is all about, here we go, this is all about how there's been private submissions to the Treasury from the OBR where they've said they've overestimated the prospects of medium-term growth in the UK, and therefore they're having to downgrade those prospects. So They're now saying they're actually reducing the forecasts by between 0.2 and 0.5% due to weakness in the economy and shortages in the labour market. And it says here, recession this year will be shorter and shallower than expected, but the long-term economic prospects are actually bleaker. So more bad news, but we'll just have to see. Obviously, you never know. Things could always look up. But so far, it's not looking great for the future.
No, but the OB are involved now. We remember what happened with the budget, the mini-budget, didn't we, under Kwasi Kwarteng? You know, they put that off. But
and Jeremy Hunt would be keen to kind of maintain stability and try and kind of get rid of the legacy of the mini-budget under Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng.
Yeah. All right, thank you, Marie. You're watching the early rundown. It's Wednesday, and still to come we'll have the sport. And just what sport is Gareth Bale turning to now he's retired from football?